I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially to those of you who have taken a moment to tell a friend about the podcast. That's how people hear about it for the most part, and I do appreciate it. My guest today is Amit Majmudar, who is a poet, novelist, translator, medical doctor. He's written, I don't even know how many books. I couldn't even find what looked like a reliable list of all of them, but his most recent poetry collection is called What He Did in Solitaire. He's won any number of awards and so on. But this week, he joined me to talk about an essay he wrote in the Los Angeles Review of Books. The essay is called The Great Game, and it is about the ways in which poetry is like a game or a sport. I disagreed with a fair amount of the essay, but I thought it was really delightfully written, and he was an incredibly good sport to come on and just talk through it with me. We also got into a few other things, including what varieties of poetry being written today are legitimate or not, and why free verse has become so dominant in the poetry world. It's a fun conversation, and I really hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's get to that right now. You wrote this sort of fascinating piece recently in the LA Review of Books, which, just on a side note, because I talked to Austin Allen recently about an essay he had there on the stigma of writing in meter recently.
Right, I read that. Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, is the LA Review of Books suddenly is it because of, I guess, Boris Australia, because suddenly formal friendly? Because it feels like they were very kind of avant-garde for a while.
He's an excellent formal poet. I actually am reading his collection right now.
Yeah, I just got a bootleg of it, so I've heard it's good.
And he's extremely deft and skilled with formal techniques in his own verse and also in his translations. So yeah, no, he's there. We have a friend, as you know, people who are formal poetry. Generally, we don't have very many people who are.
I think of the LA Review of Books as being like cool, and so I'm not used to formal venues being cool at all.
No, it's not cool. It's definitely not cool. But you know, it all these things depend on people in positions where they can signal boost that kind of thing. So I'm pretty sure that if I'd sent The Great Game, which is the essay that you're referring to, if you send it to somewhere else that never, has people in editorial positions who don't consider formal elements of poetry to be valid techniques within contemporary art or contemporary poetry, that essay would have just been rejected.
Yeah, I mean, maybe either the LA Review of Books will start to ease formal poetry in the mainstream, or formal poetry will just poison the well and it'll become toxically uncool soon enough.
I doubt that. I think that they keep it eclectic enough, and probably it'll be like it is or has been, where it's just sort of like a niche kind of element to it, but not necessarily. Hopefully, we will not allow our uncoolness to taint Mr. Dreluk's endeavors.
Yeah, no, I certainly. I was curious a little bit about the genesis of this piece, because you said you sent it out. So this was something you wrote on spec on your own.
Yeah. So actually, what happened was, and funny you should mention Austin, because basically I was years ago. I was the visiting. I very rarely get invited to universities or anything like that, but the University of Cincinnati had someone who knew my work, and they invited me to be this like Elliston visiting professor, which was a very new experience for me.
Yeah.
Because I never teach students, and I never am in a university setting for poetry. And so the initial form of this was actually a speech that I gave which I think is in their archives, the very early version of it.
Okay.
And so that was actually the text of a speech that I gave, and
Okay.
I'm pretty sure Austin was in the audience then. So I mean, I just sat on it for a long time, and then
So okay, that makes some sense, because yeah, it has a little bit of a, I mean, it's obviously playful. I mean, you even say in it that you've been sort of improvising by way of meaning and association.
Right, that's how I write everything, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, that it's
Even
yeah.
things that seem systematic, like it's just like I just extemporize it and then see how it comes out.
So I am curious about this, because you did something kind of incredible. So I'll say, like, you have griped in some places about being sort of shut out of the academic world, and that I imagine that's quite true. I will say that, like, among the formal poets I know, everybody knows who you are, and I do remember,
Okay,
like,
that's reassuring.
yeah, oh no, certainly, like yeah, that's. I mean, I also think, like, that's formal poets more broadly feel a little bit shut out of the academic world, but
Right.
yeah, like, I remember sort of exchanging a raised eyebrow with a friend at your interview with Caitlin Doyle in Literary Matters a couple years ago,
Mhm.
which I don't know if it's the entire. I think there's at least one question that seems to be a little more but for the most part, you answered her questions in rhyming verse.
I did,
You
yes.
didn't break the lines. You left it all in paragraph form,
Right, right.
but it's pretty clear when you start reading it that it's all in rhyming
Yeah, if
verse.
you read it out loud, it's in heroic couplets. And then except there's one answer which I do it in prose because that relates to the question.
Yeah. About narrative. No, that's the one. Yeah, I was wondering about that. Yeah, but
So
then you go
yeah,
back to the rhyming couplets. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And then I revert to rhyming couplets. Yeah.
So you make a claim, and I feel like with your poems and your prose, there is such a kind of playful improvisatory quality that I never know how seriously to take any assertion you make.
Good. You shouldn't take my
Right.
assertions too seriously.
But
Yeah.
you say, so I'll read one of your little rhyming. I don't know if this, yeah, I think this actually contains the rhymes cleanly. You say, my generative process, harem scarum. I neither break my poems nor repair them. Most come to me at one go. What you read is what I wrote. I let the language lead. Sometimes I fix a couplet here or there, but even touch-ups honestly are rare. I'd rather chip at an unchiseled marble. A cerulean warbler never revises its warble. So, really, this feels like one of those Frost claims where I'm just making it up as I go. Why revise? I am
Well, I discard a lot.
okay. All
So
right.
that's the difference there. I don't know what Frost did or not, but for me, I have revised poems. I'm not saying I've never ever revised. I
Sure.
have
Yeah.
revised occasionally, but that's rare for me to do that. Usually what I'll do, and you know what? Byron, in one of his letters, Lord Byron has this
Yeah.
line where he's like, I'm like a tiger. I pounce, I had to get my prey, and if I don't, I just go skulking off and I go find some other prey. And
Okay.
so what I'm likelier to do is, have some idea or have something I want to riff on or something that I want to do, and I'll just do it. And then it'll either be like, oh, that didn't come off, or it'll be like, oh, that kind of came off. I should send that out somewhere. And
Yeah.
and then I'm not as likely to circle back to the thing that didn't work. I just kind of abandon it and move on and see if something else works. Because a lot of
Okay.
times it's kind of like I'm trying to see if something like strikes, something like magic. Did you light the fire with the flint or not? And you just have to keep trying. And so that's I used to think of it almost like lottery tickets, like
Right.
there's no point in re-scratching off a lottery ticket if you didn't win with that the first time. So I just try and make my own luck.
One of the ways I think about it is in terms of, like, takes in a movie.
Mm-hmm,
Where,
mm-hmm.
part of the difference between a stage actor and a film actor is that a film actor only has to get it right once,
Mm-hmm.
and can try 100 times. And if he has the right editor and the right director, they just find that one time it just happened all at once and it was
Right.
just right. And I do feel that way certainly reading like Shakespeare's sonnets. I feel like he was Shakespeare, but it does feel like in many cases he sort of banged them out, and some of them are a little wobbly and some of them just land just
Right.
so. And I wonder if that was as much revision as it was just what another friend of mine used to call shots on goal.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I think that even poets who are really meticulous revisers, it's not like everything they do lands,
No,
and it's kind of as though I feel like poets whom we think of as having um, very high hit rates
right.
and very small miss rates, they usually have very small corpuses, like their
Yeah,
collected works are like that, are,
right.
are very, very, slender books. And I think it's because they restrain how much of their work gets out,
Yeah,
and so they create a sort of illusion like, oh, I don't write a lot, but when I do, I never miss, when you don't know
yeah,
what
yeah.
they have in their discard pile, you don't know. And so, yeah, and so Shakespeare sonnet, I agree with you. I mean, they're hit or miss, and that I think is just the nature of every poet's output. And I don't look at my own poetry and be like, oh, that one wasn't as good as this one other one. It's not a healthy way of looking at it. And so, I mean, I just again, I just let her rip, and then out of that, James Dickey was the same way. James Dickey said that he compared himself to someone panning for gold.
Yeah.
And he says that when there's a lot of grit and dirt that gets kind of out there, but then finally when I get gold, it's gold. It's the real thing. And so he compared it to panning for gold. You can compare it to lottery tickets, but
Yeah.
it's all about trying to stay in the creative zone. For me, at least, it's about trying to stay in the creative zone and trying to stay um, thinking in literary terms and poetic terms, and um, keep my keep stay keep that muscle memory, keep the linguistic muscle memory.
Yeah, yeah. I think of Jarrell talked about being struck by lightning. Yeah, no, that does make sense. I am a little bit curious because you're the overall theme of this essay, the Great Game, or it really feels like sort of a series of themed, like related short
Mhm.
essays.
Mhm.
Basically it's riffing on a comparison between poetry and play or
Right,
games.
right.
And you make, I mean, I think like I'm always interested in arguments that compare poetry to something that might be unexpected initially. I tend to think that poetry is less like games than it is more unlike than like, but I think I'm still interested in the way in which you say it's like. I was curious though, you say you talk about competition, and then you make some claims about rules. And so you say there are
Mhm.
cliques or schools in contemporary poetry that play a game whose rules are foreign to me, and I take no enjoyment in watching them play it.
Mhm.
I certainly sympathize with you there, but I don't know if I like, even in the schools of poetry where I understand kind of what they're getting at,
Mhm.
there are plenty of those that I still don't enjoy. Like I was sort of groomed in a post language poetry style school
Mhm.
and did that for a while, and I do kind of get it. I do kind of get what they're after. I just find it very unsatisfying, very
Sure, and
boring.
that holds true of games as well, I would argue. You know what I'm saying? Like there are games whose rules you can
Oh
understand, but you
yeah,
don't like to. I just don't. I'm not into that sport. You know what I'm saying?
right.
Like
Oh
I
yeah,
know
yeah,
I
yeah.
know how soccer's played, but I don't play soccer because I'm just not into soccer.
Right, right. So
Yeah.
then, yeah. So I guess the elaboration on that, though, you say to enjoy the game being played in front of you, you have to recognize the rules by which the poet is playing. Once you can tell what the rules are, you can tell whether that poet is playing the game well or not. And you also talk about like aliens watching a game of baseball. If you don't
Right.
understand the rules, it's the way like I think like most Americans feel watching like cricket. Just like, what the
Sure.
fuck is
Yeah.
going on?
Right.
I get that they're doing something, and some people are good
Right.
at it. I just can't
Right.
tell what's what. So
Right.
that certainly makes sense. But I don't know. I think like there are, when I read poems by poets who sort of have like a very high level of technical mastery,
Mhm.
I often marvel at little inventions and little achievements within the work but I think that there is and it's not that those are unrelated to the more immediate emotional effect. It's just that the immediate emotional effect is what I most envy, and it's what I most strive for. Like,
Mhm.
I don't feel as envious of a particularly ingenious Greg Williamson or John Hollander poem. I feel envious of the way in which they're able to make an arrow strike home. And
Mhm.
I think like what's also true is that you don't necessarily need to have a much understanding of the rules of a poem in order to have it affect you.
Mhm.
Right? Like, so I think there's like, there is a kind of an inside baseball mutual admiration and criticism among people who do it. But I
Mhm.
mean, part of what one of my like pet peeves is poetry that has no interest in a general reader. And I
Mhm.
think of your poems as like, there are some where you're really sort of showing off some technical, like virtuosity. But in most of them, you're writing to, I think, like somebody who's like literate but not necessarily into poetry could still enjoy what you're
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah. I mean,
That seems like a really like a different thing. Does that make sense?
yeah. I mean, I think that we are often sort of led into making distinctions or oppositions where none may exist. And I think that, sometimes, for example, with form, we're like, there's form and there's content, and the form
Yeah.
is a receptacle for the content, and these things are distinct. The way something is a container or something like that, right? A container of some true essence, and it is the essence that you want to capture, and then you're putting it into a form, right?
Yeah.
That strikes me as a false dichotomy,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I also happen to think that the head heart dichotomy is false. That the Romantic era kind of signal boosted, and it's never really been shaken. Um, the head heart distinction. Oh, this is very, emotional. So, and this is too intellectual, and this and that. I feel like people feel thoughts all the time, and it's one of the bases of fanaticism, for example, where people are seized with an ideology, a religious idea, and they get worked up over it, and they're willing to go to war over it, and this and that, right? And so I think where, am I doing technically virtuosic stuff? Am I trying to appeal to the general reader? I feel like I feel like a lot of people who aren't, quote, into poetry are super responsive to technological virtuosity in language, which is
Oh,
in
yeah.
part, which is in part why rap is so
Right.
popular. One
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
reasons
Yeah.
why rap is so popular. And I know in my own personal experience, I'm often surprised by what people vibe to and what people don't. And so I've gotten like, there's this one throwaway poem in this collection I published in 2016 called His Love of Semicolons. And it's got this whole, you probably don't remember it, but you know what? I've gotten so
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
letters about that poem, and people share it, and I still hear about it. Sometimes
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
say, oh, my favorite poem was that one about semicolons. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that was literally just me playing around with it was like, it's very, it's got this bouncy meter to it and
Yeah.
this and that, and it's about semicolons, literally about semicolons, and so that would strike me as a very sort of, you know technique oriented, literary, bookish type of poem, and yet that's the one that I hear second most about out of that whole collection.
But that's not because people understand the rules of the game you're playing necessarily, right?
I think their ears do. I think their ears absolutely do.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure, but I mean, this is like, but this is, I guess, this is where I think like there's a greater dissimilarity between poetry and games than similarity, in that I think you don't necessarily, this is in a case where you don't necessarily need to understand the rules of the game in order to enjoy it, just as understanding the rules of the game doesn't necessarily lead to
No, I think
the
that
enjoyment.
in the poetry that I'm talking about, of the sort that I'm talking about in that essay. So
Yeah,
obviously, at this point in history, there are just widely divergent forms
right.
of poetry out there, and it's almost implicit in that particular essay that I'm speaking of a certain type of poetry
Yeah.
where, so within that type of poetry, the one of the, the ear can understand the rules of a game, which is, meter, rhyme. The ear can understand it without even the intellect being involved. So people who have never thought about poetry in abstract terms, who may not know what iambic pentameter even is, it may sound like a scary Greek jargon
Yeah.
word.
Yeah. Yeah.
Their ears understand it. And that, that's a wonderful thing. That's a beautiful thing. And I've relied on that whenever whenever I find, I was poet laureate of the state of Ohio for a few years back there. And whenever I was going in front of an audience full of people who did not have backgrounds in poetry, which is in that position, you end up doing that a lot.
Yeah.
You know, I'm consistently going towards poems that had rhyme in it,
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because they get that. They get it. They understand what I'm doing. They
Yeah.
understand the rules of that game. And they do
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
without necessarily, they do it instinctively. They do it the way children understand the rules of a game, where a lot of times when you're teaching a kid, to say, well, I mean, baseball is kind of a little bit different than that, but like, you know, I feel like, you don't have to spend a really long time teaching a young kid how to play certain, games, because they just kind of watch and they get
Yeah.
into it and then they just know it. And with the poetry that, with rhyme and meter and things like that, I think it's you don't even have to give anyone a primer. You don't even have
Right.
to be like, this is how you play 5 card draw.
Yeah. Well, you don't need to teach a kid how to enjoy a nursery rhyme.
Right. You
Yeah.
don't. And that's because their ears understand it the same way the
Right.
ears understand music,
So
same way.
this is then, I think, a meaningful distinction that it may be that I'll say, like, I noticed there's certain sections in your essay where you withdraw into a like either a passive voice or a third person in a way that I suspect you're being diplomatic. You say, like, some readers find this to be, and I suspect you're being diplomatic also when you sort of make this character, when you say that, like, there are different kinds of poetry, and in order to enjoy a certain kind of poetry, you need to know the rules. And I kind of want to say, like, well, that actually may be as good a definition as any of the difference between what has in the past been sort of maligned as accessible poetry, or, like, I think the poetry I tend to be most interested in as a reader and a writer is the poetry that helps the reader understand the rules without the reader needing much of a primer.
Yeah.
And because that's not true of some school, right? There's some schools of
It's
poetry where
not.
you really need to be prepared ahead of time.
Right. No, that's absolutely true. And I think that poetry that relies on elements intrinsic to the language, stresses, sounds, alliteration, things like that. Those sort of have an advantage over some of the more arcane ones, where it's like, I'm not going to use the letter E, on this page. I'm not going to use the letter A on the
Yeah,
next
yeah,
page,
right.
where you have to have a kind of like a paragraph before you enter the work as to, what are the rules involved here? What are,
Right.
what is the poet, what constraints does the poet set himself or herself when producing this work? So I mean, there as poetry became more typographically based, I mean, and literature in general became more typographically based, there's I think, what's it called, Ulipo or something like that, where they
Right.
do
Yeah.
these kind of games with, they play those games with vowels, and I think they're setting themselves
Lipograms. Yeah.
constraints. They're setting themselves arbitrary constraints, which is which is similar to what a formal poet does. It's not that different, and you're using those constraints in order to generate and sort of drive your creativity by basically, giving yourself, forcing your invention to go around certain obstacles in order to, produce work, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I think what you're identifying again is a meaningful distinction. I think of, like, my brother's a visual artist. I think of, like, artist statements, and there's a certain stripe of contemporary visual art that you can't appreciate unless you read the artist statement, because you need to know
Right.
the
Yeah.
key. Like, oh, this is only impressive now that I know that it was
Right.
constructed. You did it only using his left hand, or you did it only.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
I
Right.
think that there are formal constraints, and I tend to think lipograms are on. I mean, like lipograms are impressive in some ways, where you deliberately drop a letter or you drop some element and you don't allow yourself to use it, but they tend to require an introduction in order for you to be impressed by them. And I think I'm most interested in the constraints that don't. Like I know this is a thing I noticed years ago at poetry readings, that poets needed to introduce any poem that involved a demanding formal constraint. They would introduce it by telling you what kind of poem it was. It occurred to me, like, well, if it's worth doing and the constraint was panned out, then
Right.
why bother to tell people what it was? Why not just read in the poem?
Right. Right.
Like,
Yeah, actually,
form and meter, meter and rhyme are hard to do, but you don't need to tell people you did them ahead of time. They can just appreciate what they're listening to.
right. Right. And I think I mentioned that when I talk about recognizing the rules of the game, you also recognize it in the way that a country recognizes another country, where you say
Right.
that this is legitimate. This is a
Yeah.
legitimate restraint that you've placed on yourself that has some value or meaning, or is worthwhile.
Yeah.
And I know that in my own personal experience, if someone is like, I didn't use the letter E in this poem, I don't necessarily think that that's all that fruitful, because a restraint, and I have trouble recognizing the legitimacy of that restraint, because
Yeah.
I feel like it's so typographically based, so spelling based, that I don't necessarily quote recognize it the way that you would recognize a legitimately governed country. Um, and that's why I tend to, I tend to prefer things like rhyme, meter. Having said that, I don't necessarily use them exclusively. I write plenty of free verse, prose poems, all
Yeah.
sorts of things. Um, and that's at this point in history, I think that there's just, there's just so many ways of writing, and I like to try a lot of them out. There are
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
things I won't do. I don't foresee myself in all the various peregrinations that I have among forms and this and that. I don't foresee myself getting to the point where I'm like, and I'm not touching the letter E for
Sure.
this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't really rule out most other stuff. I like to try different things all the time.
Right. Well, and as you said, there's a difference between what you try as an exercise or experiment, that then and there's a difference between that and then what you choose to publish. You might
Mm-hmm.
try any number of things to see what it yields, but I think that, like, that's the snotty Robert Van Warren line is, experiment is an elite word for failure, and I think what he means is, like, if you have to call it an experiment, it probably
Mm-hmm.
didn't work. Like, every good
Yeah.
piece of writing is an experiment. You just publish
Right.
the ones that worked out.
Yeah, that's true.
So I am, when you talk about recognition, the second kind of recognition, like a country recognizes another, that is so there is a distinction there between, like, approval and enjoyment. Or, like, you might say,
Right.
I mean, I
Right.
think in this essay, as I said, you're very diplomatic. You sort of say, well, this isn't for everyone. But
Mm-hmm.
there is a difference between saying this isn't my cup of tea and saying, like, I don't recognize this as legitimate. Because, like, there are plenty of countries we recognize that are still not our cup of tea.
Sure.
So do
Sure.
you?
Yeah. So subjectivity always plays into these things. I mean, it's
Sure.
an art. It's an art. So yeah.
So
And
what
that,
do you, but do where are the lines you would draw in saying this is not legitimate, whether I like it or not? I don't recognize this.
I don't recognize this. Meaning, well, what are you asking? Like, is there poetry that whose rules I recognize, or rather, I understand what they're trying to do, and I just don't like it?
Well, so this is, but I think this is what I mean. You say, like, you say recognize the way a country recognizes another.
Sure.
There are kinds of poetry that I recognize as being poetry that I just don't enjoy and I don't care for and
Sure.
I'm not interested
Sure.
in. But are there kinds of poetry that you say, or things that people call poetry that you just say bullshit? That's not, no,
Yeah,
that's
I
not
mean,
poetry.
certainly. I'm not going to name names.
You could name schools.
Yeah, I mean, look. I'll be honest with you. Late 20th century avant-garde stuff that came out of like I think it was mostly based in the West Coast. Like, I'm just not into that. It's not that I'm not into it. It's just that I'm like, why are these words sequenced in this way? And I don't recognize what they're doing, and I don't think it's legitimate either. I mean, I just think it's just, I think the only reason that that book ever found its way across my, into the library where I took it off the shelf briefly was probably because the person in question was well connected and
Yeah.
perhaps ensconced in some influential university position or something like that, and that's the only reason why it even found its way to a library in suburban Ohio. Like that's so yeah, in that sense there are forms of poetry that I don't necessarily find legitimate,
Yeah. No, I tend
and
to
they
think
go by
that.
the name of poetry.
Right. Yeah. The things that call themselves poetry. Yeah. I tend to think that, like, in order for it to be poetry, it has to be the kind of thing that at least somebody might fall in love with and recommend to a friend. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of poetry of the kind you're describing, I can imagine plenty of people writing essays about what's important in it, but I can't really imagine anyone picking it up and saying, "Oh God, I love this. You have to read this. This really, yeah,
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I don't necessarily even take it to that point where I'm like, well, it should have the potential to be subjectively loved by someone because I find, I feel like I see people, having, crying emojis over stuff that I'm just like, I don't get it. I don't get why you're having crying emojis. I don't get
yeah,
why you quote think about that poem every day. I don't get that. But there's literally, I mean, I just don't recognize the principles on which the words and letters have been sequenced on the page. Those kinds of poems exist. I feel like they get written less and less now, to be honest with you. I feel
yeah,
like there's been a strong shift away from that kind of work towards perhaps work that is I won't even say at the other extreme. I would say that work that is more centered on um, identity and grievance and political grievances and things like that. I think that kind of poetry has sort of shifted the focus of contemporary American poetry away from that kind of inscrutable academic language artifacts that used to get produced. I feel a lot more when I was starting out. I
yeah.
think there's been a change. I think there's been a change.
No, I'm definitely with you there. That, like the kind of poetry that I came up uh, resenting. I think what I
Yeah,
kind of what you might pejoratively call like nonsense poetry. I think
right.
that is in decline. I think you're right that there's like the poetry. I think there's still a lot of like parataxis and a lot of like neglect of like clear
Yeah,
thinking. But yeah, it's certainly it's almost like a different species of confessionalism. That there's a
right.
it
That
feels
that
very
that
like sentimental and self revealing.
self-revealing and self-dramatizing and things like that, which is natural. And that's a more natural mode for poetry, in my opinion,
Yeah,
than particularly I mean, that's just a more natural mode for poetry. And it was, I mean, even back then when we were probably at roughly the same time in
yeah,
American poetic history, we were both resenting the same stuff in different places. Even then I thought to myself, this stuff is time limited. This stuff has the kiss of death on it. You know what I'm saying? Like
right.
it's on it. I don't know how long these people are going to rule, but they're on their way out. You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah,
it's decay. It is decay. And so, I mean, I don't necessarily feel that way about a lot of the stuff that has taken its place, simply because it has the advantage of of being more human,
yeah,
being more human. And that's and truth be told, AI was going to destroy that other stuff anyway. Language, poetry,
right. Yeah,
whatever. Like it was going to wipe it out anyway.
yeah,
And at this point, AI can generate that stuff infinitely, and there's no point. There's no point in
Yeah.
doing it, you
No,
know.
I think that's totally right. And I do, and I agree with you that there's a that the poetry that is in a sentence right now feels more like a natural mode of poetry. And probably, and for that reason is less vulnerable to, you know, the the winds of change. I mean, like as soon as,
Less vulnerable to being supplanted by AI. Yeah,
well,
probably.
yeah, certainly, yeah, certainly, yeah, AI is not quite. I mean, partly and partly because of something you do bring up, and this felt like uh, a very decorous section of the essay, which is the relationship between the poetry and the poet,
Mhm.
and that seems to be one reason that AI could not supplant the kind of poetry that is most prominent today, is that AI doesn't have an identity, or unless AI, you know, itself becomes a kind of a you know, an identity people
Or
recognize.
generates a fake identity. I mean, that's also possible.
Right. So so I was curious. You mentioned a little bit the big scandal in 2015 when
Right.
Sherman Alexie's Best American Poetry published a poem by Michael Eric Hudson that he initially submitted, or he published it initially under the name Yifen Chu,
Right.
and then it was revealed that he was not a female. He was not a Chinese woman. He was a white man, and
Mhm.
people had a lot of strong feelings about this. You've also written in a poem. How do you say that? Where is that from? About a
Yeah.
sort of a similar approach to this question. I also like my suspicion, as with most of your claims, is that you might feel differently about it on a different day.
Correct. No,
But
I'm very much like that. Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
So
but
let's see. What is the question though? Like, what do I feel about that now? Or
so you say, for example, his poem changed for the worse in the perception of many readers. For many readers, the exact same poem or stories, when read with the author's moral and ideological vileness in mind, would lose their charm. You're talking about a kind of a hypothetical where the poet is somebody who's really explicitly awful. That
right.
holds because all art, being play, must take place on a playground, a charmed circle, the court, the field, the pitch, the page. I felt like there was a little bit of a leap between those two sentences, because there's the rules, or the, you know, you compare the breaking of the charm to like a ball that goes out in tennis, which is that, of course, like that's actually part of the game in tennis. And I also think of like any number of even like formal poems that have a moment where the form breaks in a
Sure.
poignant way. So
Sure.
that doesn't necessarily break the spell. Sometimes that kind of achieves the
hmm
magic.
hmm
I'm curious both what you feel about this question. Yeah, like
Yeah.
whether
Well,
there's a different, and like if there's a different kind of charmed circle you're talking about here.
right. I think that regarding, I think what the root of this has to do with like the identity of the writer and the sins, of the writer, and the validity or invalidity of the work. And that is, that's a very huge topic, but I
Yeah.
feel that different people respond to that differently. And if I don't know if I qualify that, if I said for some readers, I think I did say for
You
some.
say for some
Yeah,
readers very,
yeah, yeah.
that's why
And
it
so,
felt very
yeah,
scrupulous that you were
yeah,
saying
no, but
for
I
some
was
readers.
I
Yeah.
was scrupulous for a reason. I
Yeah.
was scrupulous for a reason when I was making this claim, which is that some people, you know, depending on the sin or the
Yeah.
or the transgression,
Sure.
depending on and then depending on the individual reader. Some readers and some people have a very, very sensitive, moral, sort of morally hyperdeveloped nature. Okay, I don't know if morally hyperdeveloped is just morally sensitive. Okay,
Yeah.
where they cannot bear to think that they can't, as soon as they know that T.S. Eliot said some racist things in his letters, they go to Eliot and they're like, this guy, I can't, he was a racist. He said
Right.
that stuff in that one, those letters in his private life. And
Yeah.
old
Yeah.
Possum's Book of Practical Cats isn't quite there. Meanwhile, I, who also know the same information about T.S. Eliot,
Yeah.
or here's another one. Winston Churchill. Let's bring it to my own ancestry and my
Yeah.
own, people.
When it comes to India, Winston Churchill was
My
no
own
angel.
background, right? Right. Yeah. He was nasty about Indians. He inflicted a famine in India in
Yeah.
1943, and he didn't want them to be free. And then eventually he colluded with the founder of Pakistan to help divide the British Raj into multiple countries that are now nuclear armed rivals. Blah blah blah. Having said that, I still can read Churchill's speeches and histories. He wrote a ton of histories. He won a Nobel Prize in literature, and I can listen to those speeches. I can read those books, and I just don't have a problem with the work and his historical role. I recently read like a 3-volume biography of Churchill, and I enjoyed it. Because I'm a little bit different when it comes to that. I personally am a little bit different. But I know other Indian people who wouldn't touch anything by Churchill with a 10-foot pole, right?
Sure.
And they hate Kipling too. And I
Right.
like.
Yeah.
I even gave the Jungle Book to my kids recently to read, a nice illustrated version.
Yeah.
And
You cite him in one of those interviews or essays where you as a formal model in some cases. Which I mean, he's
yeah,
so good at certain things.
he's really good at certain things. And he to digress a moment, he's one of the few poets who had a grasp on like soldiers' demotic of his era. And so he has those barrack room ballads that are like not very much read today, but they're an excellent sort of linguistic snapshot of like the British imperial soldiers' brogue transmuted into meter and rhyme. I find them very interesting.
Yeah.
Gunga Din and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And it's like it's not read today, and it's considered like almost racist today. I'm sure it could be considered classist because he's this sort of highly educated person imitating the brogue of these soldiers. But I find it interesting. I find that stuff interesting.
So
and
I'm
it's very
curious.
rare too. I find it's very rare.
Right. Oh yeah. So I wonder, because you said that part of this is a distinction of personality or sort of moral sensibility. I wonder though, because you're a student of the classics and you're also a student of history.
Uh-huh.
So I had a conversation the other night with a British poet who said that his perception was that American poets, especially in the kind of the creative writing end of things, have a very shallow well, that they're mostly drawing from the deepest the well tends to go is Whitman and Dickinson. And my experience, like, you're often lucky if it goes that deep.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I wonder how much of this question of a relationship between an inflexible relationship between the poet's work and reputation is not just a question of personality, but a question of historical knowledge or familiarity. I mean, it seems hard. Like it would be hard to read the classics if you excluded anybody who had really objectionable beliefs or practices.
Right. No, I know where you're coming from. And look, Byron was a pedophile. He was a pedophile sex tourist. He went to Turkey. Yeah. He purchased young underage boys, and I read his biography and I was like, wow, this guy was out of control. And I still like Don Juan. That, and I don't know if that's just me as a person having a tendency to divide work and human, the work and the man. Maybe I know that I'm a sinner in the eyes of God, and so I don't want anybody, taking my own personal failings and then blacklisting my work over that. But again, I tend to be just kind of, I don't know if, forgiving about, I don't know if I'm forgiving, quote unquote, but I am forgiving of the work, not necessarily.
Right. I can't remember if it's in this essay or in a different one. You make like the converse point about Byron, that some of his work was more appealing at the time because his personal reputation and presence was so
the myth of them. I mean, the myth of them. And then eventually, as he, even within his own lifetime, he became discredited and in disgrace among the sort of the elite society in Britain. And that's why he never returned to Britain after he went to Italy and then Greece. But to go back to what you said earlier about the well being shallow, I think that the MFA culture has led writers to focus on their contemporaries a lot and sort of use their contemporaries, their immediate contemporaries, as models and as the people that they're going to take in as influences. And that is, there's always that happens in every generation, but usually there's the simultaneous element of writing your way out from under the old greats, as it were. And so that's why Keats is a great example. He's influenced by the generation that was still alive at the time, Wordsworth, Coleridge, the quote unquote romantic movement. And yet when you go into his complete works, you'll see a Shakespearean play, you'll see Spenserian stanzas, you'll see Miltonic verse where he's trying to write a sort of Greek version of Paradise, a sort of Greek mythological version of Paradise Lost in a very Miltonic language, very Spenserian language, very Shakespearean language. And that process of writing your way out from under the masters of the old masters occurs simultaneously with your engagement with the contemporary world. And I think that the contemporary culture of American poetry has favored and sort of skewed that balance towards one side of things. And part of that may have to do with the fact that, as we were talking about, formal poetry is uncool, right? And therefore, the poetry of the remote past, almost all of which I think is written in form of some form or some kind or another, is automatically slotted into a sort of mental column that says, this is of no use to me as a creator.
Right.
And that is the kiss of death, because I feel that you don't read anything as closely or as, from a technical standpoint, as closely and as with as deep an engagement as you do when you're trying to learn from it and apply it to your own praxis. And and that's just human nature. It's kind of like at that point you're like, how did this writer do this? How can I learn from this? How can I apply this to my own work? That's a different kind of reading, but it's very deep. From a technical standpoint, it's very deep. And I think that may not happen as much anymore from what I can see.
And this is why I like to modify Jonathan Farmer's heuristic for Twitter, to returning to your comment about the crying emojis. My standard is I believe the crying emojis represent real emotion if you're applying them to a dead person's poem. Like, it's not that you couldn't have that response to the poem of a contemporary, but if you're tagging a contemporary and adding that, I don't.
I see what you're saying.
That's why I don't. I still find maybe it may be sentimental, but I feel like the emotional criterion for like poetic success is still meaningful, because I just think most of those emojis are lying. It's a more natural approach to poetry than.
But it's part of the general rhetorical inflation of social media.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, basically everything on social media is fascism, right? And same way, everything on social, everyone you don't like is Hitler, and everything you don't like is fascism. In the same way, every poem is crying emoji, fire emoji. And so, in the sense that you think that they're lying. I mean, I don't even know if we need to attribute mendacity to it. I think we can just attribute hyperbole to it,
Sure. Yeah. No, yeah. I don't, I think it's,
although if you are tagging a contemporary, you want them to see it. You want them to like you. Next time you post something, you want them to like, this, and then it's the circle continues, the wheel of dharma continues to spin. And so it's kind of like, it is hard to tease that out. I agree with you. Yeah.
So you're relatively active on Twitter. What are your feelings about it as a medium?
Oh, I love it.
By the way, your Twitter avatar is so intimidating. Like you look like Anton LaVey. Like, it's such a severe photo of you. You're much like nicer. You seem much nicer.
I'm a nicer guy. Yeah, probably before you got all of my before you started this, you were probably like, "Oh shoot, I better."
Yeah, I was kind of bracing, yeah, like a bouncer, yeah.
No, you know what? I don't. It's true. But truth be told, I'm a really nice person in here. Okay, but no, Twitter. I love Twitter. I think it's amazing. I think first of all, it's taught me so much. It's you know it's linked me up with some really amazing friends, not even in the literary sphere, like
Yeah,
because I do a lot of like religious stuff and historical stuff and blah 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 blah, blah and fiction and whatever. But like I've connected with some really amazing people over Twitter. You get and truth be told, I mean you can find truth on Twitter. You have to sort through a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of people are trying to fool people and trying to lie to people.
sure.
But there are usually anonymous accounts are the ones that you have to find like certain really good anonymous accounts that like are spot on about certain
Okay.
things, and they get proven right later, much later.
Do you have any recommendations?
No, no, I don't. I guess that technically you could no. It's fine. Don't worry about it. So I love that. I love it's shown me, and also I love the accounts that just share really interesting archaeological images and art images and sculptures and temples and stuff like that. I love, it's actually I would not have known to submit this to LARB if I
Oh,
hadn't connected with Boris over Twitter.
okay.
So it's a direct,
Right,
literally
right, right.
I that essay got published because of just, some interactions on Twitter where I was kind
Right.
of like, LARB might be interested in hosting this thing that I've been sitting on. It's been sitting on my hard drive for like 3 years and I never sent it anywhere, but maybe I should send it somewhere. Maybe I should send it there. And so Twitter's great. I mean, people give it a bad rap, but I think it's because they curate their feeds wrong. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
if you curate your feeds to have a ton of like political hysteria pumped directly into your veins, you're going to be very unhappy as a result of being on Twitter. But if you fill your feed with, insightful people, poems, beautiful images of, temples and nature and archaeological sites and historical artifacts, it's great. It's
right.
great. I just
Yeah,
wrote this. I just wrote one of the best essays probably I've ever written, at least from my perspective.
sure.
It's about Marcus Aurelius and the Bhagavad Gita, and
Oh,
and the harmonics between these two very stoic approaches to war. And it was weirdly, uncannily appropriate, given the unfortunate things that are happening right now. I finished it right before then, but I wouldn't have written that essay if Twitter hadn't, because I had those ideas in my mind for like 5 or 6 years. I was like, these two books are very similar, and I need to explore that. But then very randomly, Twitter just popped some Marcus Aurelius artifact into my feed, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to write this essay. I've been sitting on these ideas, just they've been rattling around my head for years. I'm going to write this essay. And so Twitter, my feed really literally just kind of goaded me into writing something that I'd put off for years.
yeah,
And it turned out I really like it. Who knows if it'll get published anywhere? A lot of times when you really like something and when something is just very much like, right there, it can often leave the rest of the world cold because it's too
sure.
Socratic. So who knows? Maybe I'll send you a link if it ever comes out. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's Twitter. That's Twitter in a nutshell. I love that.
And I have just two, I guess, quick questions for you. One is just sort of I was delighted by a comparison you made that I had not quite seen before. And this was in your piece in the New Criterion on Formal Restlessness a while back, which feels a little bit like a sister to the game essay. There's something similar happening there. But you compare the idea that poetry in the life of a poet goes through an evolution from usually it's from formal you even talk about like the formal shackles being cast off, which it's like literally that phrase appeared in the Simon Armitage book I'm reading right now. You liken that misconception that poetry in the life of a particular poet evolves into something higher, like free verse, to the old recapitulation theory. That ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is a really pleasing idea that just is, if I recall, just turns out not to be the case scientifically.
I wrote that so long ago. I'm going to have to exactly remember what I said.
I can read the little thing you wrote.
Sure.
You say human gestation involves a steady embryonic shapeshift in the womb. The body tests out neck gills and seals them, grows a tail and resorbs it, webs the fingers and frees them. A whole evolutionary past is implied in it. Fish, salamander, duck, enough metamorphoses to fill a book in Ovid. And there was an old theory that this was exactly what was happening. And I think it turns out not ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was the slogan. And I think that scientifically isn't, it sort of seems to be true, but it's not quite true. And then you say, we can make this mistake when it comes to form. We can think of a poet writing in many different forms as a preliminary fitfulness that precedes a settled adult form. Congratulations, you've found your voice, hit your stride, become who you are, and you will never bother testing out a curdle sonnet or a run of sprung rhythm ever again.
Yeah. Now I remember that. Yeah, because I was like, did I use the word ontogeny?
You didn't use that phrase, but that's
exactly,
I just recognized that.
I was like, that threw me off for a moment because I thought that was quoting what I was saying, and I was like, I don't remember.
No.
Yeah. So no, I mean that's something that I've noticed, and I think that I gave some examples from 20th century among 20th century poets.
In the next paragraph.
Who started out, writing in form, and then they quote unquote graduated to their truly modern form, which was to not scan and not rhyme.
Right.
Maybe, I think that I probably am against that idea or that narrative, probably because I write all of those types of poems in the same book or at the same time, and so I don't regard, I wrote this one in free verse, and that's more modern than something that I wrote in meter and rhyme, or meter only, or irregular meter but rhyme. And I'm all over the place, and so I'm formally restless as a poet, as you may know. And so I don't see it as an evolutionary thing. Now, maybe in the 20th century, mid 20th century, when Adrian Rich and Ashbery and Ted Hughes and all these people were, and W.S. Merwin, when they were all flipping over to, abandoning formal verse, going to free verse, and then never looking back, maybe to them, it did seem like there was a chronological or evolutionary element to it where they were quote unquote becoming modern. Yeah. And that is because free verse was newer then. At this point, free verse is the dominant convention of contemporary American poetry. And they call formal verse conventional verse, but what they're actually referring to is a bygone convention that has not been the case for at least half a century, perhaps more. And it's almost as though, hey, it's conventional verse because it adheres to the conventions of European or British civilization from 100 years ago. It's not an accurate use of the term convention relative to our society and our time. Conventional verse in the 21st century in America and in Britain is free verse, and actually in much across, in fact, much of the rest of the world. And I think one of the largest scale developments that is under discussed, in my opinion, is the fact that the Anglo-American Eliot Pound, originally Tristan Laforgue, or some other predecessors within French verse, at the turn of the 20th century, it was a niche thing within certain European or Anglophone cultures, right? And then, because of the nature of the colonial nature of the English language and the colonial prestige of European civilization at that time, it swept traditional verse forms in numerous civilizations, just swept them away, to the point where I've come across Indian literary journals, not just English language Indian literary journals in vernacular languages of India, Gujarati, Hindi. They too write in free verse, which has no actual organic development within the history of Indian languages, all right, or Indian formal traditions, shloka meter, trishtubh meter, you know, the Dohas of Tulsidas has no relationship to any of that. All right. I know I said a bunch of stuff that you probably haven't heard of, but those are various formal elements or formal techniques within those traditions. The ghazal as well, very.
They are receiving. That's a European
It
convention.
is a
They are receiving.
European colonial imposition or something that is spread. Cultural imperialism can occur. Cultural hegemony can take over. In the absence of political subjugation, and
Right.
this is the nature of
Gentrification almost.
who know. Yeah, I mean, we can call it what we want, but I find it really fascinating that 100 years ago, this was a niche thing, primarily in Anglo-American poetry. And now it has swept. In fact, I was at a poetry festival, 10 years ago, and they had this very hallowed Chinese poet from China who had come over. And, he was a free verse writer. And he was telling me how, like, oh yeah, there are some poets who hold fast to traditional Chinese forms, but we're at the avant-garde, this is the future. And I'm like, I guess your future is Anglo-American, I guess. You know what I'm saying? Like, from a literary standpoint.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
From a formal or technical standpoint of your poetry. And so I cannot think of a comparable situation where something like this has swept the poetic cultures of the world so effectively within the course of less than a century. I just can't, because we weren't as connected. You know what I'm saying? We weren't as connected. So, but that has happened.
Like so in some ways it's similar to the way rap has now become global, that you hear rap from everywhere. But I do think my suspicion is that there's a kind of a key difference between those two. Here's the hard question for a formal poet, though. Why? Why is free verse? Why did it take off? Why is it such a wildfire? Why does it sweep formal verse away in every culture? What is it?
What is it about it that does
catches
that?
hold like that?
Yeah. So there's I don't know if there's a right answer. Yeah. And so maybe you and I should just spitball some ideas.
Sure. Yeah.
So again, and I have not put too much thought into this. If I had to, because I've mentioned the phenomenon, but really I hesitate too much to go into the why, because it may be it can seem kind of like one idea would be that one idea would be that it lowers the bar for entry.
Yep.
And the other idea would be that it conceals ineptitude, which is that, if you mess up, it's so much easier to look at a formal poem and be like, yeah, that one didn't land, compared to a scattershot free verse poem. It's just a fact. Okay.
Right.
It's just
you can see what they're going for.
You can see what they're going for. And as soon as you take away, hey, this is what I'm going for. Who can say that you're a failure? Who can say that you failed? You know what I'm saying? Like, so it lowers the bar of entry. It decreases the perception of failure. And what's there not to love?
Yeah.
So I think those are my two ideas. But those are that I've had.
I kind of suspect that's right. And I wonder. There's probably not really a good way to. And
I forgot. Here's the other thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
The third thing. Whether it's a religion, whether it's any cultural form, victory and material dominance adds to the prestige of cultural forms. Okay, so basically, if America were an extremely poor country with no infrastructure to speak of, and absolutely no prestige geopolitically in the 20th century, American cultural forms, including rap, would not have conquered the world.
Right.
Okay. And so it is something that is described as early as the 11th, I think the 12th or 11th century, Ibn Khaldun in the Muqaddimah, which is this Arabic work. This is at the height of, basically Islamic civilization after the Arab conquests everywhere. And he wrote this sort of amazing panoptic view of the history and culture and sociology of his time. And he talked about, why does everyone imitate the Arabs? Is what was one of his questions that he asked. And he says, it's because we're victorious. And and if we were losers, they wouldn't do this. We wouldn't have the prestige. Conquered peoples or subordinate peoples imitate the cultural forms of those who dominate them. And it's such a simple insight, and yet it's very hard to find it. And I've looked for it, but it's very hard to find it in earlier works or works elsewhere. Right. And the Arabs at that time were kind of like the Americans of their era, right? Massive transnational empires. They were at the top. They were, and cultural manifestations. They were, they were supreme at that time. And he just had this very simple insight. And I think that's true, to be honest with you. Everything that I've seen bears that out when it comes to the American century.
Yeah.
And so what you see, it's not a given. It's not a given. And, depending on how the 21st century works, Chinese cultural forms may gain in attractiveness, 100 years from now. And this is just how human beings work. This is just how the human psyche is hardwired towards imitative or mimetic behavior of, sort of the alpha, right?
Right.
And the alpha civilization. And that was us. And that's why English is the language that it is. That's why free verse is global. That's why rap is global. That's why Hollywood movies were global. And to this day, they're global as well.
Right.
China, they make their movies now, not just for the United States audience, but also for the Chinese audience and the European audience. Everyone, it's a global phenomenon. And that's what we're seeing. Who knows if we'll continue to see it for this coming century.
If I had a better understanding of history, I would want to dig more into this question, because I think everything you're saying makes sense. And I do suspect that because of those first two reasons, the lowered bar to entry and the increased difficulty of identifying failure, I do suspect that whereas rap has the popularity of rap has increased the number of rappers, but also proportionally the number of listeners. Whereas I think that the popularity of free verse poetry has probably more disproportionately increased the number of poets than the number of readers of poetry.
But isn't there a strong overlap between those two populations?
There are, but I think like when you increase the number of poets, you increase the number of poetry readers at a 1-to-1 ratio.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
But I think with like rap, I don't
know if that's true. I don't know if that's true, because look, there are poets who have like Rupi Kaur is a perfect example.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of people read her poetry that don't write poetry.
Well, and that's why I give her more credit than I give the academic free verse poet with a lot of good theory behind his work, because people actually like the Rupi Kaur. Now, part of what they're liking is not just the word. They're liking the presentation, they're liking the profile, they're liking the photo. There's a lot that goes along with it. It's a package. Same for spoken word poetry, same for rap. It's not just the words, it's a whole presentation that people like. Right. But I think and there's the historical question that I don't know enough to have any kind of smart assessment of, is that there are cultural modes that become popular because they originate from a dominant culture. Mm-hmm. And then there are culture modes. I think there are culture modes that become popular in the other direction. I think of the Irish cultural influence on the English, the Black American cultural influence on American culture, which is really outsized, the Greek influence on the Romans, sure. where it's, I think I wonder if that influence, maybe you call that appropriation or whatever you want to call it, I wonder if that's more durable because it seems grounded in someone's actual genuine enjoyment rather than in a striving after status.
Yeah, I would think so. And historically, what you're saying is absolutely true, which is that, well, no, actually, not necessarily true. And the reason I would say this is because, and again, there's more than one moving part here. So,
Sure, sure, sure.
for
Yeah,
example, religious conversions of conquered peoples, they can throw off the political domination and yet retain the religion, right?
yeah,
But the
yeah,
religion was originally taken as a sort of mimetic behavior of the dominant imperial force. And so, a lot of moving parts there. I know what I was going to
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah.
You were talking about rap and you were talking about things like that, and versus poetry, often raising it in a 1-to-1 ratio. Historically, in my opinion, or from what I can gather, poetry has been sort of raised to a sort of level of a mass art, or an art with a large audience of non-specialists, when it has been married to music or drama
Mm-hmm.
and spectacle. And that's why the Greek tragedians, whom we today read as texts, actually packed amphitheaters
Right.
because they had actors and they had music. Okay, and they had even some dance and stuff like that.
Yeah. And
And it was
less
in
competition. But
performance,
yeah, yeah,
and in performance,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah.
Same thing with Shakespeare. Today we
Right.
read Shakespeare. A lot of us read Shakespeare plays, as poems, almost as
Right.
dramatic
Yeah,
poems. We
yeah,
call
yeah,
them
yeah.
dramatic poems sometimes, but in fact,
It's a blueprint.
they had actors, they had costumes, they had dances. They used to dance and sing songs in between acts, and at the end of the play, everyone got up and danced. Apparently, and they don't. I mean, they don't do that in modern productions, but in Elizabethan times, in Elizabethan
Sure.
production, everybody would be dead at the end of the tragedy, and then they'd get up and they'd dance a jig.
Right.
And
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
was just the conventions, right? Because it was all together. And similarly, I think on your last podcast, you're talking about Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem, right? You were talking
Right.
about how it was the entire package, right? And so
Yeah.
similarly, that's another thing. There's a performer, there's
Yeah.
a delivery, and there's a spectacle associated with that poem that's a delivery mechanism for that particular language artifact. And even Homer, with the all those sort of people who go around and perform Homer,
Yeah, yeah.
they had an instrument. Homer even refers to the lyre of the bard, right? The plucked instrument.
Yeah.
And so basically, I feel like the kind of poetry that is on the page alone or is very complex, often historically has been a niche production with a very small audience,
Yeah.
often of practitioners, usually in the court of a duke or a king. The sonnet originated at the court of a Sicilian king, I believe, if
Yeah.
I recall.
And that's how it made the leap to England too. Was in
Right.
is court
And
as a
and it's a
court
courtly
document.
form, right? And
Yeah.
so I think when we speak of academia, Umberto Eco compares it to monasteries, but it could also be compared to a court. And that's why, the basically an academic program in poetry, it doesn't fund itself. It is funded by the upwardly striving students who are out to get jobs, who pay grotesque amounts of tuition money
Yeah.
into the system. That most of that money goes towards athletics, and there's a little bit amount that's left over that's handed out as a sop to creative people, right?
Yeah.
And it is analogous to how tax revenues would come into a court. The bulk of it would be sent towards spectacle and military, and there would be a tiny amount that they would flick a gold doubloon over to the poet and say, recite for me, and that's the equivalent. That's the equivalent of what goes on at a university. And so
Yeah.
it is not surprising that academic poetry should have elements to it that are arcane or somewhat esoteric type elements, because it is fundamentally a courtly art. It's the equivalent of courtly art. It is subsidized. It does not subsidize itself for the most part. And the forms that do subsidize themselves, like you mentioned, Rupi Kaur,
Yeah.
those forms are married to something else. In her case, imagery and persona and presentation. In other cases, it'll be music, or other, cult of personality, what you name it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if anything, I thought you were too generous in some of your in the game essay. You talk about you link the prominence of a poet to talent, and I just wanted to say like, well, we're really talking about patronage. We're really talking about like Austin has a line about licensure being like the chief determining factor in poetic success. So I wanted to ask you a purely self-serving question, because we have a few of your books here, but there's a poem of yours I heard you read on the radio years ago, and I've looked for it online. I cannot for the life of me find it. It's a short poem. I want to say it refers to the Iliad, or at least to some like Greek military scene. And the image is of a severe burning. It's like maybe sonnet length. And I figured I've been looking for it forever, and I figured I'd at least ask you if that. I
read it on the radio.
I could well, I know I heard it. I didn't read it. And I think it was the radio, because I didn't listen to podcasts at the time, I don't think.
I know what it is. Is it the one about the signal fires? The signal fires across
I know it had a fire in it. It had a burning in it. So I think
was it Invocation? Was it Invocation?
That may well be. What book is that in? Because
that's the last poem in Docket.
Oh, I don't have that one. Okay. All right.
Want to read that one? Or no?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'd love. Yeah. No. Please.
So yeah, this one was actually written from my experience as a medical student in the child psychiatry unit, where there are these kids who would be sort of, who had been often abused, and like they would have these, I noticed that their arms often were messed up in different ways.
Yeah.
And so this kind of came from that. It's called Invocation. The arms I sing. Forget the man. There is no other epic. Sing the arms of kids, the ones with pustules all along their veins, like runway track lights burning for a plane that blew up hours ago with no survivors. The ones with runes no parent can decipher. One message knifed and scarred and knifed again in a mystic tongue forgotten who knows when. The arms imprinted with a shadow grip, as if the dad who grabbed and crushed had dipped his hand in black paint first. The arms with tight arcs of perforation, human bites that get infected faster than a dog's. The toddler's arms, with both hands scalded raw, all glisteny and hog pink, swollen taut, the tantrum over, the lesson taught, 2 signal fires that call across a plain. The city is sacked and all the children slain.
Yeah.
Was that the one?
Yeah. The ending is what I particularly remembered, but that's it. And the image, I think, and maybe because it's the Aeneid, but I think what took me to the Iliad was that image of the parent's handprint, and I thought of Thetis holding Achilles, like the negative impression of the hand.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for doing this. Any last bones to pick or grenades to throw?
No, thank you for having me on. And I've been listening to your archives, and it's just an excellent podcast. So yeah,
good. Yeah, no. Thank you so much. And I will. We'll see if I'll keep my eye out, and we can get you back on for some more inflammatory conversation sometime. So.
Let's do it. I'm always all about saying inflammatory things that'll get us both canceled.
Excellent. Good company for it then. That was my conversation with Amit Majmudar. You can find him on Twitter at Amit Majmudar, all one word. And I will put links in the show notes to all of his stuff, or at least as much as I can find, because again, he is just insanely prolific. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com and on Twitter at sleerickets. Thank you all so much for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.